In 1991, the world saw her face on every screen. Sunken eyes that had seen too much. Disheveled hair framing a face carved by years of abuse. A hollow voice that echoed with pain and uncontainable rage. She wasn't just another murderer waiting on death row. She called herself a survivor of men. A woman who had finally fought back against a world that had brutalized her since childhood, and she was about to be executed by the state of Florida for crimes that would shock America. Her name was Aileen. She wasn't a shadow creeping through dark alleys. She didn't stalk her victims in calculated silence like other serial killers. Instead, she hitchhiked along sun-baked highways, shot men in broad daylight, and left behind a trail of broken bodies, and an even more broken past. Between 1989 and 1990, 7 men would die by her hand, their bodies dumped along Florida's interstate highways like discarded trash. But was she a cold-blooded predator hunting innocent victims, or was she a deeply damaged woman who had been pushed past the point of no return? This is the complete story of Aileen Wuornos, America's first female serial killer, and one of its most controversial figures, a story that will force you to question everything you think you know about good, evil, and the fine line between victim and monster. Our story begins in 1956, in Rochester, Michigan, where Eileen Carol Pittman entered a world that seemed determined to destroy her from the very beginning. Her father, Leo Dale Pittman, was already serving time as a convicted child molester when she was born. The man who gave her life would take his own before she ever had the chance to meet him, hanging himself in his prison cell when Aileen was just a toddler. Her mother, Aileen Wuornos, was herself just a teenager, barely equipped to handle one child, let alone 2. When Aileen was 4 years old, Diane made a decision that would haunt her daughter forever. She abandoned both Aileen and her older brother Keith, leaving them on the doorstep of their maternal grandparents, like unwanted packages. Laurie and Britta Wuornos took the children in, but this wasn't a rescue. It was simply another form of hell. Laurie Wuornos was an alcoholic with violent tendencies and a hair-trigger temper. He didn't just discipline Aileen, he terrorized her. She was beaten with belts, extension cords, whatever was within reach. She was locked in closets for hours, denied food as punishment, and constantly told she was worthless, unwanted, a burden that nobody wanted to bear. The psychological abuse was perhaps even worse than the physical violence. Aileen grew up believing she was fundamentally flawed, inherently bad, destined for nothing but pain and rejection. At school, she was the weird kid, the one with bruises she couldn't explain, the one who flinched when adults raised their voices. By the age of 11, when most children are worried about homework and playground games, Aileen had discovered that her body could be traded for small comforts, cigarettes from older boys, a candy bar, sometimes just a moment of feeling wanted, even if it was twisted and wrong. She was a child selling the only thing she thought she had of value, not understanding the damage being done to her soul with each transaction. At 14, the inevitable happened. Aileen became pregnant after being raped by one of her grandfather's friends, a middle-aged man who saw a vulnerable girl and took what he wanted. When her pregnancy began to show, the family's shame reached a boiling point. She was shipped off to a home for unwed mothers, where she gave birth to a son she would never be allowed to hold, never be allowed to name, never be allowed to love. The baby was immediately taken for adoption, and Aileen returned home to find that even the small space she'd occupied in her grandparents' house was no longer hers. She was kicked out, a 15-year-old girl with nowhere to go, no money, no support system, and no hope. What do you do when you're 15 years old, and the world has made it clear you don't belong anywhere? Aileen learned to survive in the shadows of society. She slept in abandoned cars when she could find them, made shelters in the woods using cardboard and stolen blankets, and when winter came, she sought warmth in 24-hour diners and bus stations until she was inevitably kicked out. Her survival came through prostitution, not as a choice, but as the only option she could see, and with that life came an endless cycle of arrests, disorderly conduct, theft, public intoxication, check fraud. By the time she was 20, her criminal record read like a textbook case of someone failed by every system designed to help her. She drifted from state to state like a ghost, never staying anywhere long enough to form connections or build a life. Michigan, Colorado, California, Florida, always hitchhiking, always hustling, always alone. She had no friends because she'd never learned how to trust. No family because the one she'd been born into had rejected her completely. For decades, this was her existence. A hand-to-mouth life on the very edges of society, invisible to most people except when she was being arrested or moved along by police. She was what sociologists call throwaway people. Individuals our society discards and then pretends don't exist. But in 1986, something changed. At a gay bar in Daytona Beach, Florida, a place where outcasts and misfits could find temporary acceptance, Aileen met someone who would alter the trajectory of her life forever. Her name was Tyria Moore, tied to her friends, and she was everything Aileen had never had. Stable, employed, capable of genuine affection. For the first time in her 30 years of life, Aileen felt something that might have been love. Tyria didn't judge her past, didn't recoil from her damaged history, didn't treat her like a disposable object. In Ty, Aileen found what she thought was salvation. Someone who might actually care whether she lived or died. But love, it turned out, came with its own pressures. Tyria had needs. She wanted nice things, comfortable accommodations, a lifestyle that required money, and Aileen, desperate to keep the only good thing in her life, threw herself into sex work with renewed desperation. Every night, she would hitch rides with strangers, disappearing into cars with men whose names she never learned, whose faces she tried to forget. November 30th, 1989. It was supposed to be just another night, another John, another few dollars to keep her and Tyria afloat. Richard Mallory picked up Aileen on a Florida highway, a 51-year-old electronics store owner who had his own dark secrets that wouldn't emerge until much later. What happened in those woods off Highway 19 would be disputed forever. According to Aileen, Mallory became violent, tried to rape her, threatened her life. She claimed she fought back in self-defense, pulling out a .22 caliber pistol and firing 4 shots into his chest. She took his money, his car, and his life. And something inside her changed forever. Whether it was self-defense or cold-blooded murder, the killing of Richard Mallory opened a floodgate that Aileen couldn't close. Over the next year, 6 more men would die by her hand, their bodies scattered along Florida's highways like a macabre roadmap of her rage. David Spears, a 43-year-old construction worker, shot 6 times and left naked in the woods. Charles Cascadden, 40, a part-time rodeo worker whose body was found 3 weeks after his murder. Troy Burrus, 50, a sausage salesman who had stopped to help what he thought was a stranded motorist. Peter Seams, 65, whose body was never found, but whose car was discovered, crashed, and abandoned. Dick Humphreys, 56, a former police officer and child abuse investigator. Walter Gino Antonio, 60, a security guard and reserve police officer. After each killing, Aileen would return to whatever cheap motel she and Tyria were calling home. She would hand over the stolen money, the credit cards, the personal belongings of dead men, and she would tell herself, and Tyria, that it had been so, that these men had threatened her, that she had no choice. As the body count mounted, law enforcement began to connect the dots. The victims were all middle-aged men. All had been shot with the same caliber weapon. All had been found near highways in central Florida. All had been robbed of their valuables. Witnesses began to come forward. A blonde woman had been seen with several of the victims before their deaths. Sometimes she was accompanied by a brunette. They drove the victims' cars after the murders, used their credit cards, pawned their belongings. But to Aileen, she wasn't a serial killer. She was a survivor who had finally learned to fight back. In her mind, every man she killed represented every man who had ever hurt her. Her father, who abandoned her through suicide. Her grandfather, who beat her. The friend of the family who raped her at 14. The countless Johns who had used her body and discarded her like trash. The line between victim and victimizer had blurred beyond recognition in her damaged psyche. She told herself that these men deserved to die, that they were all potential rapists and killers, that she was protecting not just herself but other women like her. It was a delusion born of decades of trauma, but it was the only thing that allowed her to sleep at night. By late 1990, the investigation was closing in. Despite Aileen's efforts to cover her tracks, she had made critical mistakes. A palm print left on a car, eyewitness descriptions that were remarkably consistent, credit card receipts and pawn shop records that created a trail impossible to ignore. The breakthrough came when investigators identified the two women from multiple witness descriptions. Aileen Wuornos and Tyria Moore, two lovers living on the run, funded by the possessions of dead men. When police finally located Tyria Moore in Pennsylvania, they offered her a deal that would determine both women's fates. Full immunity from prosecution in exchange for her cooperation in bringing down Aileen. Faced with the prospect of life in prison or death row, Tyria made the choice that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She agreed to betray the woman who loved her more than anyone ever had. The plan was simple but brutal. Tyria would be wired for sound and sent to speak with Aileen, who was being held in jail on outstanding warrants. She would try to get Aileen to confess, to provide the evidence needed to secure convictions for the murders. The recorded conversations between Aileen and Tyria are among the most heartbreaking documents in criminal history. Aileen, desperate and paranoid, suspected something was wrong but couldn't bring herself to believe that Ty would betray her. Even when she had every reason to be suspicious, love made her vulnerable. "I'm not going to let you go to jail," Aileen told Tyria during one of their conversations. "If I have to confess, I will." It was the ultimate act of love from someone who had received so little love in her life. She was willing to take full responsibility to protect the person who meant everything to her. On January 9, 1991, Aileen Wuornos was arrested at a biker bar called The Last Resort in Volusia County, Florida. She was drunk, defiant, and completely unaware that her life, as she knew it, was over. When the handcuffs clicked shut, she was still more concerned about what would happen to Tyria than what awaited her. The woman who was led away in shackles bore little resemblance to the frightened 15-year-old who had been thrown out of her family home. This was someone who had been hardened by decades of abuse. Someone who had learned that the world showed no mercy and expected none in return. When Aileen Wuornos went on trial, it became a media sensation unlike anything America had seen before. Here was the country's first confirmed female serial killer, a woman who had turned the traditional victim-predator dynamic on its head. The courthouse was packed with reporters, true crime enthusiasts, and people who simply couldn't look away from such a spectacle. The prosecution painted Aileen as a cold-blooded predator who lured innocent men to their deaths for money. They presented evidence of the murders, the robberies, the lies she had told. They argued that this was not self-defense, but premeditated murder committed for financial gain. Her defense team tried to present the context of her life. The abuse, the abandonment, the decades of trauma that had shaped her into what she had become. They argued that she genuinely believed she was acting in self-defense, that her damaged psyche couldn't distinguish between real and perceived threats. But Aileen herself was often her own worst enemy in court. She was volatile, unpredictable, prone to outbursts that shocked even hardened court observers. When she didn't like a question, she would explode with profanity. When she felt cornered, she would lash out at everyone: prosecutors, defense attorneys, even the judge. The most devastating moment came when Tyria Moore took the witness stand. The woman Aileen had killed for, had protected, had loved more than life itself, sat in that courtroom and provided the testimony that would send her to death row. Watching the only person she had ever truly loved testify against her broke something fundamental in Aileen. But even then, even in that moment of ultimate betrayal, she found it in herself to forgive Tyria. "I understand why she did it," she would say later. "She was scared. I don't blame her." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with their verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced her to death. It was the first of 6 death sentences she would receive, one for each proven murder. Aileen Wuornos was transferred to death row at the Broward County Jail, later moved to the Florida Correctional Institution. She would spend the next 11 years in a 6-by-9-foot cell, waiting for the state to end her life. During her years on death row, Aileen gave numerous interviews, and what emerged was a picture of someone whose grip on reality was steadily deteriorating. Sometimes she was lucid, articulate, capable of discussing her case with startling clarity. Other times, she seemed to inhabit a different world entirely. She began to claim that prison officials were poisoning her food, that there was a massive conspiracy to silence her, that the police had sonic weapons that could control her thoughts. She spoke of being tortured by sonic pressure, and claimed that the state wanted her dead not for her crimes, but to cover up larger government conspiracies. Her appeals wound through the court system for over a decade, but they were largely unsuccessful. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and her increasingly erratic behavior made it difficult for even sympathetic observers to argue for her mental incompetence. In her final interviews, Aileen appeared to have aged decades beyond her years. The defiant woman who had once claimed to be a survivor of men had been replaced by someone who seemed eager to embrace death as a release from her suffering. On October 9, 2002, at 9:47 a.m., Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at the Florida State Prison. She was 46 years old. She had spent more than a decade on death row, longer than many of her victims had been alive when she killed them. Her last statement was characteristically bizarre and unsettling. "Like Independence Day, with Jesus, June 6th. Like the movie, big mothership and all. I'll be back, even in death." She remained an enigma, someone whose damaged mind operated by rules the rest of us couldn't understand. Aileen Wuornos died as she had lived, alone, angry, and convinced that the world had never given her a fair chance. Her death closed one of the most controversial chapters in American criminal history, but it didn't answer the questions her life raised. Was she a monster who chose evil? Or was she a victim who was manufactured by a society that failed her at every turn? The truth, like most truths, probably lies somewhere in between. She was responsible for her actions, but those actions didn't occur in a vacuum. Aileen Wuornos represents something uncomfortable about American society: our ability to discard people we deem worthless, and our shock when those people strike back. Her story forces us to confront questions we'd rather not ask about justice, mercy, and the price of abandoning our most vulnerable children. In the end, Aileen Wuornos wasn't just America's first female serial killer. She was a mirror held up to our collective conscience. reflecting back the ugliest parts of who we are and what we're capable of becoming when love, compassion, and basic human dignity are stripped away, one betrayal at a time. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you think differently about the nature of good and evil, don't forget to subscribe to UTAK Diaries. We bring you the true stories that leave questions echoing long after the screen fades to black. Because the most important stories are often the ones that don't have easy answers.